Across the world, scientists are racing to find a vaccine for COVID-19. Without a cure, a vaccine is the only way to protect people from the disease and phase out social distancing. Research centres in the UK, the US and China are testing potential vaccines on local volunteers. But scientists say that to get enough good data, they need to run trials in different environments and on a range of people. And earlier this year, 2 French doctors suggested Africa would be the ideal place to test a vaccine. That caused some serious outrage online. Some people united under the hashtag Africans are not lab rats, while others said this was just another example of Western exploitation of the continent.
Africa is not a laboratory, neither are we Africans lab rats. So
experts who have studied pharmaceutical firms say developing countries, like those on the continent, are attractive for medical trials.
What you see is that they can do it there faster and cheaper. And faster has to do with big patient populations that are more eager to participate in a trial because they have no access to healthcare otherwise.
But the fact it's easier and cheaper to find participants doesn't make those trials unethical. What really matters is that there's informed consent.
A trial needs to be voluntary and with fully informed consent. And in low resource settings, this is often more difficult because sometimes there were cases that participants were not aware they were participating in a trial, or they were not explained very well what the risks were. You can question the voluntariness of some of these trials, because if you have no access to healthcare or a treatment, and your only option is actually to participate in a clinical trial and get an experimental drug, you can ask if this is really voluntary participation.
This is one of the reasons why medical trials in Africa are such a sensitive subject. There are also some well-documented cases of unethical trials.
The drugs company Pfizer has begun making payments to families in northern Nigeria whose children died or were left disabled.
In 1996, in Kano State in northern Nigeria, 11 children died and dozens were left disabled after receiving an anti-meningitis drug called Trovin. Some of the parents said they didn't know their children were part of trials. This started a long legal battle between the American pharmaceutical company Pfizer and the Kano State government. Pfizer denies that their drug caused the deaths and disabilities. They settled out of court, paying $175,000 to each of the families. But the story of those children stuck in many people's memory, shaping their attitudes to medical trials, even though a lot has changed since 1996, according to the World Health Organization.
We've come a long way in building an infrastructure on the African continent on monitoring vaccine clinical trials, but also at large, medicine clinical trials. Clinical trials all over the world are conducted following very, very strict guidelines that are dictated by WHO, but we can't rule out, like in any other process, some flaws in the way things are going when it comes to the implementation. That is the case not only in Africa, but also in many other countries. What I can say is that the clinical trial that we are seeing going on the African continent for the moment are really being performed according to those international standards.
So far, one vaccine trial is underway on the continent. In South Africa, another in Kenya is awaiting approval. And in April this year, the Democratic Republic of Congo said they were prepared to take part in potential trials. And there's a reason why some African nations are keen to take part.
We would also be more confident to know that the vaccine works in an African population, rather than just having the vaccine tested elsewhere, and once it has been licensed, for it to be then assumed to be working as well as it worked wherever it was tested. It is crucial that Africa participate also during the development of the vaccine, so that if we have data showing that the vaccine works, we also have data from African population where it was tested.
And there's another good reason for testing a vaccine in Africa. Under international guidelines, if you test the vaccine and it's found to be effective, you must make that available in the country where you tested it. So if those trials in South Africa succeed, South Africans will be given access to the vaccine at an affordable price. Given the global demand for a vaccine, that's an advantage worth having. Without it, Africa could lose out to richer nations.
In an interview with the BBC, the Executive Director of the African Population and Health Research Centre, Dr. Catherine Kyobutungi, said, "So the largest danger that Africa faces is that the vaccine is out there, and the rich countries buy all of it, and there is none left for the Africans."
One of the best ways to avoid this is having African vaccine trials, and the continent has a strong track record in developing effective vaccines.
I can just give you an example of a vaccine that was developed regionally for the African continent. This is the conjugate meningitis A vaccine. That was developed really having in mind the response against this pathogen in Africa. So the clinical trials were conducted in several countries on the African continent, in Mali, in Senegal, in Ghana, monitored through the local scientists, and the vaccine was successfully developed, launched since 2010 in different countries. And so far, we have immunized more than 300 million people with the new conjugate meningitis vaccine, literally eliminating outbreak of meningitis A vaccine.
There is also, says this African scientist, a moral reason for testing vaccines on the continent.
COVID is a global problem, and Africa cannot just sit waiting for solutions to be made elsewhere and be beneficiaries of those solutions. The West, Europe, America, Africa, Asia, South America has to participate in getting a solution to this global problem.